Crisis? What crisis? The word jumps out at every turn, but where does a crisis begin? How does it evolve? And perhaps more importantly, how can we learn to stop it happening again? Today's big ask with Reuters Breakingviews editor Hugo Dixon. Do we overuse this word?
I think we do. We devalue the word to mean just a terrible situation, a problem, that sort of thing, whereas actually it has, certainly in my view, a much more precise meaning. If you look back at the etymology, for example, it comes from the Greek krino or krisis, which means a judgment. The Greek Orthodox Church even uses it in the term the final judgment.
Yeah.
It's a judgment, and the point is, therefore, it's a decision point where you can decide. You can decide, depending on what you decide, you can either go to heaven or hell, or
right. Right. And in fact, we'll come on to that because you prefer this idea that a crisis is split up into two parts. But before we get on to that, let's talk about this Kindleberger, Charles Kindleberger theory. Where it's split into, 5 or 6 parts? And I think we're going to put them up on screen now.
Bits. Yes,
so let's very quickly tell us what those bits are.
Okay.
Do you want to remind yourself?
Yes, let's get the 5. The 5 phases of financial crisis.
Here they come.
First of all, you have this shock. He calls it a displacement, normally a positive shock. Then you've got the bubble, where you hype the benefits. Then you've got distress as the game's up. You've got it all here. The crash comes, and then you've got the depression afterwards. And this is certainly it works for some financial crises, and it's quite a useful schema if you want to do it. But I prefer, as you say, something because
a simpler system, which is
slightly simpler.
The bubble and the crash.
Yeah, the bubble and the crash is very simple. But also because I'm interested in looking at the connection between financial crises and other types of crises. I mean, you have business crises, political crises, psychological crises, medical crises. I mean, all the whole sorts of things.
But the psychology, whether it's political, whether it's financial, whether it's medical, it's always the same, isn't it?
Well, there are similarities. You definitely can read across this. You have the mania and the denial in the sort of bubble phase. Yeah. And I mean, you just look back. Just look back at the credit bubble, or look at, for example, what happened with Greece, or what happened with Portugal, or what is happening with Spain. I mean, you have the politicians in denial. They do not want to accept that they need to bring in the men in black, the IMF, or whatever else it is.
But that bloody hell moment, is that part of the bubble or part of the crash phase?
The bloody hell moment where you say, oh my God, the game is up, the emperor is not wearing any clothes, now we recognize it. That is when the bubble ends and the crash begins. That is the second, that is really the sort of, if you go for a sort of two-phase split, that's when the second phase of the crisis,
and part of this,
that's really and that's when you could say the crisis proper begins.
And panic, scapegoating sets in. You say in your piece, this is when it gets really nasty.
Well, it is, and you see what's interesting is, on the one hand, there's the way that people behave. So you have the mania in the bubble, and then you have the panic in the crisis. But there's also how you think about what situation you are in. And in the first phase, you've got the denial, and in the second case, you've got the scapegoating. And in both cases, it's a failure properly to confront what has happened or what is happening, and that then leads to further unhealthiness in the system.
Do you think human beings, because you talk about how we might learn and how we might avoid getting into similar situations in the future, do you think human beings are actually capable of not reacting in a very short-termist fashion, not panicking when things go wrong? Is that possible?
I think we're always going to have crises. I mean, history is lurching from one crisis to another, I think. So we're always going to have crises. The best we can hope for is that we don't, two things. One is that we don't repeat the same crisis again and again. And the second is that when we are in this bubble phase, that we can perhaps nip it earlier, prick it earlier, so that then, almost all of the evidence is that the longer it goes on, the bigger the splat, the worse the problem afterwards. Yep. And secondly, once it happens, that you actually are ruthlessly honest about how you got there, that you share, you do have to have some blaming, but you share the blame, and almost always it's everybody. I mean, take, for example, the financial crisis. I mean, the bankers have not apologised enough. But it's not the bankers who are only to blame. I mean, the politicians to blame, the regulators to blame. Yeah. Frankly, all of us are to some extent to blame, because we're all living it, pretty much all of us, living high on the hog. And that failure to explain and then to acknowledge and to take ownership for our share of the blame then makes it harder to reform the system in the future.
Very interesting. Hugo, many thanks for that. You can find that piece on the Breakingviews website. Pick up a copy of the IHT, the International Herald Tribune. It's on the back page there. There is more Breaking Views on Reuters.com and the Insider platform. Tune in each weekday, 10:30 London time for that. I'm Axel Threlfall. This is Reuters.